Hi, and welcome to another episode of Tom Kennedy Science. And I'm of course your host, Dr. Tom Kennedy. Now, in this video lecture today, I'm going to continue on my series of photosynthesis. And we're going to talk about something really interesting today, and that is how pigments actually capture light energy. Now, to understand this, we need to know, of course, the nature of light, and that will explain how, or at least help us understand how the pigments capture light energy. Now, of course, I have always been intrigued with quantum mechanics and relativity, but the world at the scale of atoms is really weird, right? And that's important because when you think about it, photons, which are subatomic particles, interact with a molecule of chlorophyll to excite an electron. Well, we're going to talk about all of this. That's at the quantum scale, right? And there's some interesting things going on, some weird things going on with photosynthesis. I'm going to take a deep dive at the end of this lecture, and I'm going to go into some of that potentially quantum weirdness that goes into biology. Interesting. So before we dive into how pigments actually absorb sunlight, let's take a step back. Let's look at the big picture of photosynthesis and why we need sunlight in the first place for this. So photosynthesis, photo means light, synth means put together. So in photosynthesis, we're going to put something together using light. So we're going to take some carbon dioxide, right? That's inorganic carbon. There's no hydrogen to it. And we're going to take some water, and we're going to combine those two to form glucose. And as a byproduct of this, we're going to release some oxygen. Okay, so let's think about this. Carbon dioxide plus water. These are, carbon and carbon dioxide is fairly oxidized. So to do photosynthesis, to fix carbon, which means taking carbon dioxide and sticking it onto an organic molecule, that's carbon fixation, you make it available to life, you need a couple of things. You need a source of hydrogens. You need a source of electrons. And of course, water, when we split water, we're going to supply those hydrogens and electrons from the water. And then this is an endergonic reaction, right? Because your product, glucose, is some kind of a complex molecule, right? I mean, it's not that complex, but it's way more complex than carbon dioxide or water. It's got a lot more stored energy. So this is an endergonic reaction. So if you're going to have an endergonic reaction, you need a source of energy. And ultimately, that source of energy is coming from sunlight. Well, sunlight hits me all the time, right? It hits everything around us. Doesn't mean I can use it. So for plants to use sunlight, they need to be able to absorb it. And that's where our pigments come in. Now let's talk about light for a second, okay? Let me flip over here. Now, when it comes to photosynthesis, we all know it uses sunlight, right? And sunlight comes from our star. I know, our sun is a star, like all the thousands that we see in the night sky. But stars get their energy. What happens is, our sun, which is 1,000,000 times bigger than the Earth, at the center of it, at the core of our sun, it's so hot, it's so dense that it takes hydrogen atoms and it just rips apart the electrons from them. But not only does it do that, there's so much kinetic energy that the protons just slam into each other and they fuse, and you can actually slam these electrons and protons into each other and get neutrons, and then you get neutrons slamming into protons and protons slamming into protons, and you build up helium nuclei. You're making helium. And that process is called nuclear fusion, and every time that happens, whenever a proton fuses together with another proton, that releases energy. And we see it as heat and light. And it's kind of weird, like, the sun, it's big, but it's not enormous. It takes like 1,000 years for a photon of light to make its way through the sun and go from the core of it to the surface. But you know what? It only takes like 8 minutes to travel 93 million miles from the sun to get to the earth. Now, light, what is light? Okay, so whenever these protons fuse, okay, it releases energy. Now when I slam my hand, that releases energy. You hear it as a sound wave. Now these nuclear processes, they release energy is electromagnetic radiation. Now electromagnetic radiation is made up of these little tiny packets of energy called a photon. Okay? Now photons travel in waves. And the distance between the wavelengths, or the distance between the peaks and the troughs, that is your wavelength. And the shorter the wavelength, the more energy it has. And the longer the wavelength, the less energy it has. So if you're thinking about radio waves, microwave, infrared, these are photons that have a wavelength that's long enough that we can't see it. And in fact, radio waves easily pass through our houses with no problem. Now, when you get around a wavelength of 700 nanometers, nano means billionth of a meter, what happens now is you can see that light as red light, right? So infrared is anything longer than that 700 nanometers. Now, the wavelengths get shorter and shorter and shorter, and we go quickly run through our colors of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet. And violet has a wavelength of about 400, 380 nanometers, right around there. You get shorter than that, 350, you're in the ultraviolet. And then you can go from ultraviolet light, and that carries a lot of energy, right? We can't really use ultraviolet because it's powerful enough that it can damage proteins, right? It breaks them apart. And then you get to things like X-rays and even shorter ones, which are gamma rays, and these carry enormous amounts of energy. So when we look at plants and they're all green, that is because they are absorbing visible light, mostly in the reds, oranges, blues, and violet. So that's what they do. They absorb light. So light is a form of kinetic energy, right? So electromagnetic radiation is the entire spectrum from radio waves to gamma waves, right? Visible light is a tiny, tiny, tiny portion of that. And like I said, from just 400 nanometers to 700 nanometers. And you can literally get wavelengths of light that are a meter long, a billion times bigger. But the point here is that our pigments, like chlorophyll and carotenoids, they absorb different colors of light. So, and they reflect the ones that they're not absorbing. So all of our plants, almost all of our plants anyway, are green, which means they are reflecting green light. And if you're a carotenoid and you're orange, you're absorbing the greens and the blues and the violets, and you're reflecting the orange light. Now, let's think about that. The world to us is green, right? But why do plants not use green light? And how do we know they don't use green light? Well, there's this really cool experiment. It was done back in the 1800s by Henkel, I think. And he was like, what frequency of light are these plants using? Obviously, we think it's, not green, so they reflected. So he did this kind of cool experiment, and he put these photosynthetic bacteria on a slide. And, cyanobacteria, if they're photosynthetic, they're going to release oxygen. Well, there's also bacteria that use oxygen, right? So what he noticed after a few hours is that the bacteria that used oxygen migrated to areas of the slide that were under purple or red light, and they moved away from the areas that had green light. What that showed is that those oxygen-using bacteria were moving to areas where these photosynthetic bacteria were creating oxygen. And we know if you're making oxygen, if you're releasing oxygen, you're doing photosynthesis. Okay, so here we go. We know that the different pigments, there are different forms of chlorophyll. There's chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B. There are different types of carotenoids. And this is their absorption spectrum. And that lines up right along with their action spectrum. Their action spectrum, of course, being what they're actually absorbing and using to capture energy. Their absorption spectrum is what they're actually absorbing as light. And like I said, we see them as green because they're reflecting it. I know. Why wouldn't a plant just be black, right? Or why not red? Why would you reflect green light when it's clearly got more energy than red light? Or why not be black? Why not have a black leaf that absorbs all the frequencies of light? There must be an answer to that. So let's take a look at our chlorophyll molecule. It is an organic molecule. It does not fit neatly into one of the 4 macromolecules. It's got a long hydrophobic tail made up of a molecule called isoprene. So it's an isoprenoid tail. It's hydrophobic. Yeah, that makes sense, right? It's embedded in the thylakoid membrane. The interior of a membrane is hydrophobic, so you want an isoprenoid tail, which is mostly carbon and hydrogen, to react with that. Then if you notice, there's a head region up there. It's got all these ring structures, and in the one of them, it's got a center of nitrogen that holds in magnesium. Magnesium is not carbon, nitrogen, or oxygen, obviously. It is a metal. And what that means is in group 2, that the valence electrons of magnesium are pretty far away from the nucleus. It doesn't hold on to them very tightly, which means magnesium can easily lose its electrons. It's easily going to lose its electrons. We can use electrons to reduce carbon. We need a source of electrons, which is going to supply that magnesium. It's going to be water. There's some things going on here. So when light strikes this molecule, strikes chlorophyll, it's going to absorb it. And what it's going to do is it's going to kick these electrons up in energy levels. And this is getting to the answer of why plants are green. Like I said, it's an interesting thing here. And then there's these other pigments called carotenoids. You've seen carotenoids. This is what, like, beta carotene is a type of carotenoid. These are things that make stuff orange. Sweet potatoes, carrots, golden rice. Those are carotenoids. These colors come from these pigments, and they're used to help protect the chlorophyll. You see, chlorophyll is absorbing all of these different wavelengths of light, and if you're absorbing things like in the ultraviolet and stuff, that can become damaging. So carotenoids actually help protect the plants from ultraviolet radiation. Okay, now, in my classes, one thing that I'm always trying to get people to understand is the difference between superficial knowledge. You repeat a statement, but versus real understanding. Do you understand what you're saying? And I've been talking about these plants are green, right? And the superficial response is, oh yeah, plants reflect green light. They're absorbing all the other frequencies, but they're reflecting green light. Okay, that's not a wrong answer, but it's superficial knowledge, right? Because you don't understand why. Here's where it becomes important to understand why. Because the question is, why would a plant reflect the frequency of light that has more energy than red light, right? I mean, the whole point here is to take the energy in sunlight and transform it into chemical energy that can be used by the plant and life in general, right? So why reflect a wavelength of light at all? Especially why reflect green light that's way more energetic than red light? The answer lies in the bizarre world of atoms, right? I mean, at the atomic level, the world does not behave the way it does in our macro world, our large world. And I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. But basically, here it is. You already know that atoms have a nucleus of protons and neutrons, and surrounding that nucleus is a cloud of electrons, and these electrons occupy different orbitals, each orbital being further away from the nucleus. And these orbitals are a probability function of where you're most likely to find the electrons. I know, weird, isn't it? And not only that, the orbitals and these electrons exist in different energy states. So a ground state would be 0. And then you can either exist in state 1 or an excited state 2. You cannot exist in between 0 and 1 or 1 and 2. All right, I know that's weird. So here's what happens. Red light has enough energy to excite an electron from its ground state up an orbital or up an energy level to level 1. Blue and violet light have enough energy to pop it up even more to a second energy state. Green light, on the other hand, cannot excite an electron to a discrete energy state. So when green light hits an electron or hits the magnesium atom and hits a chlorophyll and it transmits it to the magnesium ion atom, what happens is it'll pop it up in an energy level, but then it falls back down. And when it does that, it emits heat or some light, but it's been degraded, right? So entropy is taken into effect. So the issue is here, green light cannot excite an electron to a specific orbital. And you've actually seen this before, right? Like glow-in-the-dark stickers. What happens is you turn your lights on, you turn your light off, the electrons get excited, and as they fall back down in energy, they emit heat, and they also fluoresce. So they will emit photons as well. But here's an interesting stat about photosynthesis, about chlorophyll in general. This is crazy. The amount of energy that is transferred to the reaction center in chlorophyll, and that's something we'll talk about here in a bit, is 98%. Chlorophyll molecules, once a photon hits it, it is capable of transmitting 98% of that energy. Only 2% of it or less is lost as heat and degraded light. That's amazing. That is one of the most efficient methods of energy transfer known to mankind. Think about it, 98%. That is almost unreal, right? Okay, now that we know that why plants are green, that discrete energy state and then that extreme efficiency of photosynthesis is interesting, okay? We're going to come back to that soon. So these energy transfer and the fate of the electrons inside our chlorophyll molecule. So now we have what is called an antenna complex. And the antenna complex is made up of a bunch of what is called chlorophyll B, and then it's got these carotenoids, and then there's like 200 to 300 of these chlorophyll B molecules surrounding a reaction center, which is made up of a dimer with a couple chlorophyll A molecules, and it's centralized here, okay? So that's the reaction center. So basically you can think of the antenna complex as like a satellite dish, right? The light comes in, it excites these electrons, and then it transfers the energy to the reaction center, and then shoots up an electron high in energy, and then what happens is it gets picked up by an electron acceptor. Okay, and that's how these antenna complexes and the chlorophyll molecules actually like transform the kinetic energy of electromagnetic radiation into chemical energy stored as potential energy in these high energy electrons. Now, this is where it gets really cool. Now, the textbook talks about inductive resonance, that the energy is transferred by a resonance. If you've ever seen a wave at a football game, everybody stands up and goes wave, sits back down, the next person stands up, sits back down. So the idea is the energy is transferred without a single person ever leaving their seats. The energy is transferred without the electrons actually ever leaving their magnesium ion. They just go up in energy, they go back down, the energy is transferred. And if you notice on that diagram, it shows it as a random walk, just going from one chlorophyll molecule to the next until it reaches the reaction center. Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think so. I know the book shows that and everything, but let's point out this. Here's an observation. We don't know everything, right? 98% efficient. That random walk doesn't make sense. And like I said, textbooks often present stuff as though we know exactly how it works. Like it presents with all these facts, and they'll sometimes say, yeah, we don't know this part. But I don't think we know how this works very well. And I think that we're still trying to figure this out. So the answer to how that works might rely on the weird world of quantum mechanics. And it's been thought for a very long time that quantum mechanics, that weird world of how things work, that's way different from us, doesn't really work in biological systems. We can explain almost every biological function through classical physics and chemistry. And maybe we can, but I don't think we can. So to understand why I think that this model is wrong, and I didn't come up with this on my own. I'm reading what other people are doing. This is not my ideas. But let me explain to you a quick thing about quantum mechanics for those of you that don't understand. The world of subatomic particles, protons, neutrons, electrons, atoms, and even small molecules is bizarre, right? The hardest thing for us to wrap our heads around is they don't act like we do. I'm right here, right now. You know exactly where I'm at and what I'm doing. The subatomic particles, like an electron, and that's what we're moving around here, they can act as a wave, they can act as a particle. And not only that, they can do it at the same time. They can be both a wave and a particle. They can it's called superposition, right? They can do multiple things at once, which is really odd. I'm either moving or I'm not. Well, not necessarily an electron. It also means they can be in multiple places at one time. Let me restate that. An electron can be in many places at once or can be at one place. And in fact, they're everywhere until you look at them, and then they decide they're going to be in one spot, right? It's called decoherence. Well, actually, quantum coherence is this property that electrons can be a wave or a particle. They can be both, and they can be everywhere all at once. And then when you measure them, they go through what's called decoherence, and they cease being everywhere or a wave all of the time, and they are in one spot. I know we never think of a particle being in two places at once, but there is over 100 years of experimental data and enormous amounts of theoretical underpinnings and experimental data showing that yes, subatomic particles can be in multiple places at once. Weird. So, this is not in the book. You'll never see something like this in an intro textbook, but this is just way too cool for me to let go. And this is important too, right? I've got to go on my little tangent about science, right? The importance of making observations, asking questions, challenge what you know. This is the heart of science, right? Science is about a curious mind wanting to understand our universe. It's not a collection of facts. So let's go do some science. Here's my observation. Photosynthesis. These chlorophyll molecules are 98% efficient at collecting the energy of photons when they hit them. That's crazy. 98% of the energy gets transferred to the reaction center. This is one of the most efficient processes known. That's my observation. Question. How is photosystem 2? How is this photosystem so efficient? How does it transfer so much energy here? Okay, here's the challenge I make. This shows a random walk. Now let me explain to you what a random walk is. Random walk is you're just randomly moving from one place to another until you make it to the reaction center. Here's a problem with that. At a random walk, basically the distance you're going to cover is related to the square root. Okay? Oh, I know. So imagine if you're out randomly walking around looking for your keys. You lost them. Actually, we know that keys, we won't go there. You lost your keys. You start doing a random walk. In 1 second, you cover 1 meter. Sounds good. Okay. After 4 seconds, take square root of 4, you cover 2 meters. After 9 seconds, take square root of 9, you have 3. You cover 3 meters. So as your distance gets bigger and bigger and bigger, or you spend more time, you cover less and less distance. That's important. So if you're doing a random walk, there's no way. There's no way you could be 98% efficient. The energy would dissipate, and it would take time. This is almost an instantaneous process. So do you think there's another explanation? I do. Let's think about this. This is our challenge. This is where science moves forward. Okay. So do we need another explanation here? Let's find out. Now let's say we apply some quantum effects. Let's say we think about quantum coherence. I know this is way far from our biology book, but bear with me. These electrons, they get bumped up in energy from the photon that hits them, right? Okay, well now they can start acting as a wave. They can explore all possibilities to the reaction center at once. I know. Wow. And then once it finds its reaction center, it undergoes decoherence, and there's a particle right there at the reaction center, and the electron almost instantaneously found its way to the reaction center rather than doing the random walk. Is there evidence for this? Oh yes, there is evidence, and in fact you guys should go look it up. Plants and quantum computers. There's some really interesting stuff on the web about that. So that quantum effect might explain the efficiency of photosynthesis. And in fact, the founders of quantum mechanics back in the 1930s and 40s, like Schrödinger and Feynman and Heisenberg, these guys basically predicted that quantum effects would have a large impact on biology. And in this case, the quantum effect probably really matters for the efficiency of photosynthesis. And full disclaimer, not everyone fully agrees with this, right? Other scientists are unsure of the evidence. They say, well, maybe it could be another explanation. But the point is, we probably don't know exactly how this works, and people challenging, what they see is important and trying to overturn that. And who knows? This could be revolutionary. It could be a dead end. I don't think it's going to be a dead end. It's almost certainly going to be revolutionary. I think we're in a biology revolution right now in terms of understanding the importance of quantum effects on biological systems. Now, this is really important. I mean, I talk about this and you're going, oh, why do we care about the efficiency of a chlorophyll molecule? Why do we care about the explanation? This has enormous implications for our life. Right now, we need energy. And in fact, we've gotten in the past most of our energy from the burning of fossil fuels. We know what that's doing is causing global climate change. But imagine if we could build really efficient solar panels that mimic what happens inside of plants. That would revolutionize our energy productions. Also, I don't know about you, but I need a fast computer all the time. Imagine if we could do quantum computers that could simultaneously figure out all the answers and then zone in on one at one time. I mean, it would be almost infinitely fast. That'd be amazing. The point is, for us to like make these breakthroughs in things like solar cells or quantum computers, we need to understand how nature does it first. And nature's been figuring out how to make photosynthesis incredibly efficient for over 3 billion years. And we're getting close to figuring this out. So let's think about this. I want to take a step back. We took a little segue here. These pigments, what they do is that they are going to take the energy in sunlight and they use that to excite electrons to different energy levels. And then that makes its way to the reaction center, which then sends up an electron very high in energy and is picked up by an electron acceptor. And of course, that electron acceptor gets reduced and the reaction center gets oxidized, and it actually creates a hole, a positive hole right there. And we're breaking apart that charges. It's called charge decoupling. So these so for photosynthesis to work, we need a source of electrons. And then we also want to know what happens to these electrons once they get picked up from the reaction center onto the electron carrier. And so next, we're going to look at photosystems to understand that. And you're probably already realizing what the source of electrons is for photosynthesis. It comes from the splitting of water, which we needed sunlight to do. So these photosystems not only capture energy to elevate electrons, they're also doing it to rip the electrons away from water. Okay. Well, this has been another episode of Tom Kennedy's Science. Next one, we're going to do photosystems.